Today's paper is co-written with Angelos Angelou, Dimitra Panagiotadou, and Felix Agroni. They are somewhere in the audience, so hopefully they will intervene later. And Labrini already presented the title. It's part of a Research England project that I held last year at Queen Mary. The purpose was to do a global mapping of the use of expertise and evidence-informed policies in the management of COVID-19. And a part of this project was this survey and the paper that we've written after we finished, so in the summer and autumn. So this is the first time we're presenting it, and we are very keen to have your input and your thoughts. The question that we're asking is how expert involvement has affected levels of public trust towards crisis management policies. So we are interested to understand if the role of experts has changed and maybe upgraded during the pandemic. We know that empirically from the qualitative side, but we wanted to see also what this meant for public opinion. So this is why we did this survey in 4 European countries: Germany, Greece, Sweden, and the UK. And we see from the findings, and I will explain why these countries a bit later, that citizens are actually welcoming an increased participation of experts in policy making. And this is an important finding if we think what the literature already says, that it's that when we have high public trust, we have more possibilities of higher compliance with policies. So this is a very important finding for policymakers. So what I'm going to do in this 20 minutes, hopefully, and please raise a flag or something if you see that I'm talking more than I should, is to give you an overview of our argument, explain the research design, and discuss the results of the survey and our preliminary conclusions. So our focus here is on political trust, which means trust towards government, the democratic system, and public institutions. We see trust as a dependent variable, and we are in this set of the literature that argues that actually increased levels of trust have occurred. The literature up to now, and especially in relation to COVID-19, says that this is a result mainly of a rally around the flag effect, because citizens were either in agreement with the policies or were in favor of the idea of confinement, at least at the early stages of the virus. And also because anxiety means that citizens were keen to trust the known institutions, which was the government and the experts around it. We want to see if this is the only case and if it was really only rally around the flag effect or something more. So we decided to focus upon the instrumental side of trust, which means whether trust of experts and evidence-informed policies had to do also with more effective policies and what it means for citizens to see, to be able to feel that the politicians know what they're doing, and actually what this means at the end for political trust. So a few definitions before I continue. Instrumental trust is about exactly the emphasis on the belief that decisions are based on credible evidence and to their efficiency. Experts, here we refer to experts as professionals with recognized expertise and competence in a particular domain, and also authoritative claim to policy relevant knowledge. So this can primarily be academics, but it can also be bureaucrats and policymakers in agencies that are related to the crisis that we are discussing, but also think tankers that are communicating a lot of the knowledge. And finally, evidence-informed policymaking. We used to talk about evidence-based policymaking. This term has changed a bit in the literature. We can discuss that later, the why. So evidence-informed policymaking is about the employment of expert input to design and implementation of policies. What we know from the literature, there is a whole discussion about the role of experts in policymaking, which sees this as a bit of a technocratic legitimacy thesis. So experts are useful for effective policies versus accountability, transparency, and co-creation. So whether when we use experts, we lose in accountability, transparency, and co-creation with other stakeholders. A recent article by Virtue, which was on climate change and the role of policymakers, shows that the public welcomes expert involvement in policymaking, and that although this discussion about accountability and transparency is important, it doesn't undermine the trust that the public shows to policies that are actually have been developed by experts. We therefore go further to ask what happens actually when we are in a crisis. Do we see the same effect when policymaking is fast-paced, condensed, and less transparent than in normal times? And we think that the COVID-19 pandemic is a very good example, since experts had an even more central role than in other crises and than in normal policymaking. So our hypothesis is that the public will continue showing high trust levels towards evidence-informed policymaking and experts during complex crises. And this, of course, derives from the literature, but also we're seeing in the media in the first stages of the crisis. So what we decided to do was to select 4 cases, all in Europe. The public opinion survey was conducted in March of 2021 by YouGov, and the countries that we selected were Germany, Greece, Sweden, and the UK. We wanted countries that had different political trust environments, and there we used the OECD measurements. So Sweden and Germany are both high trust societies, political trust I'm referring to here, versus the UK, which is low, and Greece, which is low but closer to the average. We also wanted to see countries where we had different containment strategies and results when it goes to actually million. So here we chose Sweden, which had a liberal approach to the containment strategy, and the UK, which also had a liberal but also more delayed reaction to the virus, versus Germany and Greece, which both had conservative and more mainstream strategies, with Greece being faster. And this was what we had. The table shows you what we knew about deaths, what the deaths were when the survey was conducted. So what was the environment that we were in March 2021 when the survey was conducted. So to go straight to the cases and say a bit more about the 4 countries. In Germany, what we had during the COVID-19 crisis was 2 permanent scientific bodies that they were both guiding the government, and they were both favoring restrictive measures. The communication of the containment strategies was actually happening by one of the 2, the RKI. The government was very much following the advice of the experts, and the regions had a very central role to play because of the federal system of Germany, when it went to both the management of the emergency and the health administration. In Greece, in contrast, we had an ad hoc experts committee. The experts environment in Greece before the crisis was not so well organized as in the other cases, but we saw this ad hoc experts committee of health professionals taking a very active role very early on in the COVID crisis. They favored preventive and restrictive measures, and the government really accepted all of the suggestions uncontested at the first stage. The communication was taking place by chief scientist Chiordas and the General Secretariat of Civil Protection and Crisis Management, and this was very successful at this first stage. And the centralized structure of the country, which normally is seen as a problem, in this particular case, was in favor of the management of the pandemic. Sweden, again, we had an environment that used the experts always in policy making. So we saw the use of a permanent body, the Public Health Authority, which was guiding the government in contrast to the other two cases for recommendations and not confinement. The idea here was that the public opinion and the nature of Swedish politics would be much more in favor of recommendations. The political culture would be much more in favor of recommendations than very strict regulations. Here again, as in the other cases, the head physician was prominent in the communication, and again, the regional authorities were central in the implementation, as well as the local authorities. And although we had a surge in deaths, trust of the public towards this kind of approach did not seem to change. And this was not shown. This is not only from our survey, but also from surveys that took place in Sweden during the crisis. Now, in the UK, it was staged again with a permanent body that, together with an independent group, with a couple of independent groups, guided the government. Here we had a variety of expertise, and this was very interesting. So it was not only medical expertise that was used, but also behavioral scientists and social scientists. But in comparison to what happened in the other countries, the measures that were taken, the restrictive measures, were taking place a bit later. A lot of power was given to the devolved nations and to the local level, but this actually caused more confusion. SAGE was central in the communication campaign, similarly to the other cases, and we can go in more detail in the cases later on. Let me show you now a few of the results that we have from the survey. So the first result, it's very much what we were expecting, is that in all 4 countries, we can see higher level of trust when government policies come directly from experts rather than just from the government. So the public was very much in favor of policies coming from the experts in this particular crisis. And you see the different percentages here, with Sweden and the UK being higher than Greece and Germany, but all of them quite high. And there was a conviction between the public that actually the use of expert inputs leads to better policy decisions. The orange says better policy decisions, and the yellow, neither better nor worse policy decisions. And again, this was, we see a very high percentage in Greece, but also similarly in other countries. The third one is a bit more interesting, because what we see here is that people thought that maybe the use of experts was not sufficient at all times, so we could have more of them. And in a way, this showed that they were also not so satisfied with the way the use of expertise was communicated to the people. So here, this is even more interesting, because it says that it's not only that we are in favor, but we would like to see more. And the third one is that it's important, the importance of policymakers to take in account using different types of experts' inputs. Again, this is interesting for us social scientists, because what we see in all the countries, less in Germany, but similar percentages in Greece, Sweden, and the UK, is that the public was favoring the use of also social scientists and economic experts in the decision making in this particular crisis, and not just medical experts. And this is coming it's in contrast with findings that we have from other research and surveys about the role of social scientists in the managing of crisis and in policymaking more generally. The fourth is about overtime trust towards experts, pre-pandemic versus during the pandemic. And here, what we see is a slight drop in the use of in the trust toward experts during the pandemic, especially in Greece and the UK. We tried to discuss and explain that in our article, and I will say a bit more of it later. But it seems to be that there is an issue there with experts having too much, taking too much of the communication upon them, and that this is something to be thought also in the future. So the public wants the experts there in the communication processes, but they also seem to lose their trust when things don't go very well, when they see experts communicating the policies. So to discuss a bit what we have up to now is that certainly there is a strong demand for evidence-informed policies during the pandemic. What we see, though, in difference to other papers written about the role of experts during this phase, is that the technocratic legitimacy thesis seems to be a strong driver for the public. And it's not only this effect of trusting institutions that rally around the flag. So there is quite a bit of this in the discussion and in the answers that people gave. So there seems to be also a demand for experts' involvement in policy making after the pandemic, both medical and social science expertise. So people seem to say this was good. We need to see this happening more also in other policy areas. This is very much in line also with the argument that Bertram is making in her paper. But what we see is that the experts' involvement in crisis management has reputational risks for experts. And this can maybe explain the drop in trust towards experts in Greece and the UK. But also we see the symbolic significance of experts, since the public puts a lot of emphasis on the importance of them participating in the communication of the policies. And I'm going to the conclusions now. So we see that the public seeks experts' input during the crisis, especially with respect to complex issues requiring authoritative expertise. A lot more could happen with research in the area, so it will be interesting to do a bit more of an in-depth analysis of the role of experts in different political-administrative systems during the pandemic to understand what works in different contexts. So go a little bit further in our qualitative research, which is what we would normally do first, but this time we started with the quantitative. And also try to understand more the reputational risk for expert involvement in policy making, since we argued that their role will be increasingly important, since crises are not going to stop visiting us. They're going to be more likely to be the norm, and the experts' role will be more and more important for resilient solutions and societies. And I think here I will end so that we can open it to the discussion, and maybe my co-authors will want to add something later on. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Stella, for this very interesting and topical paper. I would kindly ask George now to discuss the paper.
Thank you very much, Lambrini, and thank you all for inviting me. It's a great pleasure. to be in your company. And this is an extremely interesting and topical paper. I don't need to explain why. I find it very well structured. The choice of cases is very balanced and very well defended for very clear reasons. And I think I would point to a few questions that it seems to me invite for more discussion and offer opportunity for greater elaboration. So one of them has already been pointed out by Stella. You mentioned that the reputational risk for the experts seems to be quite significant in terms of their staking their legitimacy and their kind of claim to impartiality, political impartiality, in their affiliation with the government, or the fact that they have been chosen in a way as agents of the government to either communicate or defend the legitimacy of the policies involved, or to explain science in simple terms to the broader public, and then defer to the government for the right decisions. And my question is, and I think this is what invites a broader analysis, how exactly is the role of these experts in this process perceived? Are they viewed as the people that the government has recruited in order to vest with legitimacy and persuasiveness its own policies? Are they seen as the kind of sort of borrowed legitimization of the government's policies? Or are they seen as those who are truly taking the decisions and advising the government to follow the kind of policies that derived from their scientific analysis and expertise, and the government indeed follows their policies? In other words, are they sort of viewed as principals or agents in this process? And who is it seen that the actual, who is viewed as the actual decision maker in these critical moments where decisions have to be taken, as you very well explained, under conditions of speed, whether fast-paced and condensed, and another word that I cannot read from my notes, and which is associated with your observation, Stella, of the reputational risk for experts. Is there a kind of scapegoating strategy involved on the part of the governments that choose the experts in order to kind of reduce the burden of deciding, taking very crucial decisions under high uncertainty, crucial decisions that affect lives of people and whose effects might backfire at a later point? If it is judged that, for example, the government misjudged the urgency and the severity of a pandemic crisis, and therefore lives of people were at stake. Or quite the reverse, that the government overreacted in terms of overstating the urgency of the crisis, and therefore the economy was destroyed. The stakes are very high, and of course you pointed out the rallying around the flag effect, which is important because it sort of already lends a significant degree of legitimacy to the governments in taking decisions under such crucial conditions. But I think it is quite vital here to actually decipher what is it that the role of the governments is with regard to these experts. Are they used as a shield? Are they used because the government really relies on their critical advice, or a mix of these two? So the scapegoating aspect is, I think, important and relevant. And of course, the other thing that you pointed out, and I think is worth expanding on, is how does the low efficiency or the low credibility of the government affect the credibility of the experts themselves? Reputational risk that you mentioned. I did not fail to notice that the UK is the case where the trust in experts was higher before the pandemic than during the pandemic. And I cannot help thinking that this might have something to do with the kind of, how could I put it, chaotic way in which the government in the UK handled the crisis and communicated its handling of the crisis. And that ended up affecting the credibility of the experts themselves. And I guess this poses a broader question of whether there should be a kind of line that is drawn, a kind of a cordon sanitaire between the experts and the policymakers in such cases where it is clear that the decisions are part of the political executive and the advice is the job of the experts. Have governments attempted to draw this line? This comes at a risk because it deprives them the possibility of using the experts as scapegoats, but it also has benefits, because at the end of the day, the government can take the political credit of having reacted in an effective way. And there have been governments that have reacted effectively and have been credited for a successful management of the crisis. And then I guess the broader question is, how can you expand and stretch this case study and this relationship between governments and experts to other types of crises? I mean, the kind of very idiosyncratic element of this crisis was that it was a health crisis, a pandemic of the type that at least the Western world hadn't seen for a century, certainly in these proportions. We do not have many cases, many crises that present such features. In most cases, crises have somehow been repeated in the past. There is a kind of a precedent in terms of the knowledge that has been accumulated, not just within the expert community, but within the policy-making community and decision makers and the government echelons, or certainly the civil service, on how to deal with such crises. In this case, I think it was quite unique that the civil service itself did not have a kind of a map, a roadmap on how to react, and a lot had to be constructed de novo in terms of how to deal with such a crisis. And mind you, a crisis under conditions of high globalization and movements of people. So, a crisis where you cannot really shut down cities, countries in order to contain a pandemic, as you might have been able to do in other historical eras. So can you, what would happen and what could we learn from this crisis in terms of a crisis which is not a pandemic crisis, but is, say, another financial crisis? Would the opinion of experts there be equally trusted as was trusted here? Or would they be seen as parts of the system, as being somehow sharing a blame for this crisis in the way that they are actually being viewed by the more anti-systemic, anti-vaxxer fringes of the ideological spectrum. The people who do not trust the doctors and the experts because they believe that they actually have a responsibility in being part of the whole nexus that produces vaccines and thus also produces the viruses that vaccines are supposed to fight, and that they're a part of the system of the status quo that has its own agenda and even instrumentalizes a pandemic in order to promote it. How would experts be viewed if a panel of sort of economists, for example, were summoned in order to opine and dictate to the government or suggest to the government how to deal with the financial crisis? I remember when the crisis broke in 2008, the Queen of England had called, I think, she had made an appeal to economists either for advice or kind of I don't exactly remember the type of appeal, but it had a degree of desperation in it. But there was an appeal to experts. What can we do now? And I remember watching a documentary where Gordon Brown was supposed to have read almost every book that had and paper that had been written by experts in order to find out what he could do in the face of this unprecedented crisis in 2008 as a decision maker. What can we learn from this case when it comes to crises that are not pandemics, that do not involve viruses, but are closer to the kind of expertise that you have singled out as a sort of social science experts? What do we have a sort of migration crisis, financial crisis, and any crisis that is associated with the mobility under conditions of globalization and interdependence as we have today? So these are some of the questions that have been prompted to think about, having been forced to think of something to say in response to this very interesting paper. And thanks very much for listening. I look forward to the points made and the questions that will follow.
Thank you, George. Stella, I think you can respond to George, but before this, let me just remind to our audience that you can place your questions in the special Q&A space that we have, so that I can then read them to Stella afterwards.
Yes. Thank you, George, and thank you, Ladi. George, you're posing all the questions that we like discussing in our qualitative research. But for once, I did something less qualitative. And this is exactly what we said at the end. We need to go more in depth to the cases. We have done it for Greece, at least. So I can say a bit more on Greece, because we've written an article with Angelos and Dimitra that we looked in detail on the Greek case. But I think on the reputational risks, I think what's going on is that obviously the public is not fully aware of the policy process as we very often think when we analyze it as public policy analysts. So I don't think it is clear for the public who is actually responsible for the decision. And I think you're very right to say that there is a bit of scapegoating there. Boswell was talking about it in her book about experts and the immigration crisis, how they are used in a symbolic way. And that's what we meant in the discussion, to bring legitimacy to the government. And what is happening is, I think that very often the public is not fully aware who is responsible for the decision. And in this particular case in COVID, I think this was even more prominent, because exactly the government didn't know what to do, exactly because of the medical emergency. And in many instances, certainly in Greece and in Sweden, from our cases, they followed the advice almost 100%, at least at the beginning. So when things went wrong, they started, maybe the public started losing trust on both the government and the experts at the same time. So it's difficult to disentangle all this and to be able to say exactly what should be done to avoid that. Yeah. What I have been wondering very often is whether the governments will be able to find the best experts to support them if this continues happening, and if this crisis emerge so often, whether they will be able to convince the best scientists to stand by them and actually support them in their policies. I don't know, I have to mention this film, the Don't Look Up film, that came just after we finished our paper, and just seems to show and to say so similar things to what we were finding from our survey and from our cases, and what Virtue is also showing with in response to climate change. So the public wants the experts, but it's also ready to blame the experts if things don't go right. About the lessons to be learned for future crises, this is a big question, and as you probably know, I was working on the Eurozone crisis before, so and also on the way the European Union reacted to this crisis from an economic point of view, and whether expert advice was taken into account. I think this is obviously more difficult to say in crises that are not so close to life-threatening events, immediate life-threatening events, such as COVID. I think it is encouraging to see in our survey that people want to see more social scientists being involved in solutions, but I think it will actually depend on how often we have this crisis and how close the one crisis is to the other. So if we have, and I think we will have, another crisis very close to this one, it is possible that the public will remember and will be aware of the role that experts play and will show trust to them. And certainly the bureaucrats will, and the policymakers will. And we saw that with the Recovery and Resilience Facility, there is a lot of lesson drawing there, since we have the same policymakers having to deal with a very similar crisis, economic crisis now I'm talking, with the Eurozone crisis. So I think there can be lesson drawing, and unfortunately, because crises will be coming very often and very close one to the other. Now, what is happening with crises such as the climate crisis, which is a bit more long-term crisis, whether people will trust the experts there, they will, but will the politicians use the expertise? This is a bit more difficult than in a crisis that it's so immediate as the COVID. So not many answers, but just speculations, and I guess more questions for us to research. I don't want to take more time because I know there may be more questions or reactions from the floor. So yeah, thanks for now.
Thank you, Stella. So I will read 3 groups of questions that have come. Nicolas Zachariadis asks, while the items have been mentioned, can we formalize the analysis a bit? To what extent is the role of experts in low-trust countries a question of blame avoidance and not a question of voter demand? And then Kira Garzo asks, she says, thank you for presenting this very interesting paper. I know that my question goes a bit beyond the scope of the paper, but I was wondering whether you had any reflections on why people seem to trust experts sometimes more than others. I'm thinking mostly of the slogan, this country has had enough of experts, which was heard a lot in the UK in relation to Brexit. Why did many people in the UK not trust the experts' economic forecasts about Brexit, but they trusted expert advice regarding COVID-19 measures? And then David Blackman, he asks whether you take account of the different degree of devolution in the different countries. For example, the foreign nations in the UK and the German landers they have main responsibility in public health. And then he comments, one has to distinguish between expert evaluation of a crisis and administrative execution of government policy. I believe that there would be much less trust of economists giving advice than medical experts giving advice. So Stella, if you want to respond, thank you.
Yes, thanks. I would like, I can answer the second two, and then if you can repeat a little bit Nico's question, or I mean, it's a pity he cannot put it himself. We have used his work in the paper, but I didn't have time to catch it. But about the second one, Kira's question, and about why people seem to trust some experts more than others, or experts in a situation more than in another situation. I think it is certainly, this is shown also from our survey, it is much more natural for people to trust experts in the natural sciences and medical experts. And I think this COVID crisis, in reality, for the first time, made people realize that maybe even experts such as medical experts don't have only one answer. I think they used to trust them much more easily than they will from now on. The social scientists and economists were never trusted as much. But I think this crisis, this COVID crisis, exposed the fact that even these hard sciences don't have ready answers, or they cannot really tell you for sure. So I think the public was educated at the same time as the policymakers on how expertise is not definite, no matter what sciences we are looking at, social or medical sciences. Yeah. And I think this is an important lesson for the future and for future crises. When Brexit was going on, or when the Eurozone crisis was going on, the expertise were coming mainly from social scientists, the same for immigration crisis. And their trust was much less, but it was also seen as more normal that we don't trust the experts, because social scientists don't have one answer. Somehow I think we were expecting more from medical experts. But what is interesting, and I think it has to do also with the different administrative systems that the third question was asking, and how people see this. What we found was that people trusted much more the experts that were actually close to the government, so the official experts, yeah? So they didn't trust expertise that was coming from independent sources that much. We asked this question when we were trying to understand maybe vaccines hesitancy and whether people will trust experts that are not coming from sources that are reliable. But I think we ended up finding out that actually this combination of government, institutions, and the way they choose experts brings the most trust to the system. Devolution is certainly something that played a role in all four cases, and the way the advice was executed. So in Greece, it was much more easy than in the other three countries, because we have a centralized system. So the local government, the regional authorities were only implementing. So this is not maybe so democratic, but in this case, it was very much easier for the government to have an efficient response. In Sweden, we are all even talking about networked decisions. In the UK, the devolved nations, of course, had to introduce their own measures. So this meant that there was more confusion. In Germany, the same. There is a very interesting paper by Vampa that shows that this regional, the countries that are less centralized found it much more difficult to execute the experts. And I think Nico's question was about low trust societies. Can you repeat this a bit?
He asked, to what extent is the role of experts in low trust countries a question of blame avoidance and not a question of voter demand?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't. I don't think we are saying it was an issue of voter demand. The reason why experts were used in low trust countries, For example, in Greece, that we didn't see expert use in the past, but we saw it during COVID. I think that's why we say it is more important to see the technocratic legitimacy argument a bit more. We argue that the government was using was asking for the experts because they were really looking for a good solution. They didn't know how to do it by themselves, so they really needed the experts. And what we find about the public trusting the experts comes afterwards. It's not because the public demanded experts. Yeah. So I don't know if I'm answering the question, but we can continue the discussion later.
Labrini, can I attempt an answer
course, yes.
to Kira's question? Because it seems to me the reason why experts were not trusted in Brexit in the UK was because the debate was about at least that was the narrative about the Brexiters, was about repatriating power from the elites and Brussels to the people and Westminster. And experts were viewed by the pro-Brexit part of the electorate as part of this same international elites that were actually not advocating for the return of power to the sovereign institutions, so sort of the anywheres versus the somewheres, to put it in Theresa May's inimicable dichotomy. That was the divide. So experts were not trusted by the Brexiters, and then subsequently, when Brexit proved to be a train wreck, politicians were not trusted by at least half of the society that had lost its trust to politicians after having been misled by them over Brexit.
Thank you, George. Stella, I don't see any other comment. Yes, there is one comment from John Psara saying that the question of pandemics has been mentioned from time to time over the years and was always put off as a distant possibility by successive governments. So governments were unprepared in 2019, 2020 when COVID-19 arrived. So there's a second comment by John Psaras as well. Follow up to what was said is that the WHO provided confusing and opposite viewpoints. In addition, people's trust in government is at a low point with good reason, as the pandemic was politicized. Experts that should have been listened to were compromised by politicians. In my opinion, experts that collaborated should have been segregated from the government. So those are the comments. I don't know if you want to have a final response, Stella.
Thank you, Labrini. I have in the chat from my co-authors, Angelos is wondering if he could say a word. Is that possible? So that I don't close the paper. They are in the audience, but I don't know if they can speak.
I am afraid that technically it's not possible, I think, unless John knows how to do it. I
can unmute it.
Ah, okay, yes.
Angelu.
Yes, that would be great. I mean, it's a pity we are not in an easier space, so we can all talk. But it'd be nice to have one of them.
Yes, of course, yes.
Hi. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much. I just wanted to comment on the last question by Professor Pagoulatos on, kind of lessons drawing from different crises, because that's actually something that's painfully close to a grant proposal we had with Stella a few months ago that was axed, unfortunately. But anyway, I think the main thing we had out of this is that the real question here is what really accounts for the varying influence of experts in different crises, right? And I mean, the one thing that, it's obvious to everyone is that the nature of the crisis kind of decides that. And why this is the case? Because of incomplete information, right? I mean, in a medical crisis or natural disaster, most likely politicians have less of knowledge about the type and the causes of the crisis, so the demand for information is higher. So, experts are kind of more important there. I think what is more interesting, and one should actually look more into this in the future, is that if we see experts as kind of players of the political process and in the decision-making process are kind of central parts of it, then this also becomes a question of the strength of experts, right? I mean, how much power do they have within the institutions? And I think that's interesting because, you know, if you have kind of an expert community, let's say, rising to the top of the financial department of a country, then I mean, their influence is going to be much higher when you have a financial crisis, right? So in that sense, you know, the argument about having a cordon sanitaire between experts and politicians actually comes on its head in the sense that, you know, maybe you want some experts at the top echelons of the policy-making process so they can actually kind of, you know, decide more or at least provide more evidence-informed policies during crisis. So, and this is a question of resilience, right? I mean, you cannot do it ad hoc when the crisis arises. You should actually embed this kind of institutions within your framework before the crisis emerges. And this is a lesson, right? So that would be it.
Thank you, Angelos. We have various things happening at the same time on this issue, and hopefully there will be more coming in the details of this discussion, because I think it's becoming more and more interesting how we can embed experts in these political processes in a clear way for the public, anyway.
Thank you, Stella. Thank you, George. Thank you, Angelos. So if no one wants to add anything, I think we can say goodbye.